Thank you. So welcome everybody to the Digital History Seminar tonight. As you're aware, this session will be recorded and it will then be uploaded to our YouTube channel later on, should you want to share it afterwards. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight, where we have a fascinating paper coming up. I'll be chairing the paper this evening. My name's Alice Kinghorn. If you've not yet seen, we have a fantastic range of speakers planned for our seminar this year, alongside our popular postgraduate panel, which is our next session. And so please do visit our website to see the full seminar programme and sign up to our newsletter if you haven't already done so to receive updates on the next seminar. I will now introduce our speakers for this evening from Northeastern University. We're thrilled to be hearing from Jessica Parr, who's Professor of the Practice in History and Digital Humanities, Killion Mokwete, who is Assistant Professor of Architecture, Bahare Sanaie-Movahed, who is GIS Specialist at Northeastern Library, and Patricia Davis, who's Associate Professor in the College of Arts, Media and Design. Tonight, our speakers will discuss the African Building Heritage Project, a praxis in new media as memory. This project is a collaborative and interdisciplinary project between Northeastern University and L'Ecole du Patrimoine African in Porto Novo, Benin. It uses LiDAR scanning, 3D modelling, geospatial technology and social storytelling to document at-risk sub-Saharan African buildings. So we'll hear from our speakers tonight for around half an hour for the paper, and then we will have some time for questions. If you have any questions as we go, please do put them in the chat and we can come to them at the end, or during the Q&A, you can turn on your microphone to ask any questions. So thank you so much for joining us tonight again, and I will now hand over to our speakers.
Thank you. I am going to drop the project's Instagram page into the chat so you can see some things. We have a little bit of the curse of Bill Gates, so our slides are not what we had quite intended. I'm going to kick off with a little bit of overview, and then I will pass off to my colleague Killion, who will talk about the LiDAR scanning and building aspects of it. And then our colleague Bahare will talk about the geospatial work. And then finally, our colleague Patricia will talk about the sort of next steps in sort of the ethos of Black memory. All right. So this is, as was explained, an interdisciplinary project. We have an architect, Africana Studies scholar, myself, who is a historian and cross-trained as an archivist, our colleague who does geospatial analyst work, and an engineering professor who's not on this call, as well as our colleague Frank Ogu, who directs the L'Ecole du Patrimoine African in Porto Novo, Benin, that holds the mandate for African-centered cultural heritage programs over in Africa. So their primary campus is in Porto Novo, Benin, but he has a broader network of what was once 26 different cultural heritage schools in French and Portuguese-speaking Africa. We also have working with us a series of graduate and undergraduate students in various specialties, as well as supporting this. So the African Built Heritage Project is intended to create a geospatial database of 3D models of at-risk cultural heritage sites in sub-Saharan Benin, in sub-Saharan Africa. And we started in Benin in part because it is a culturally diverse place, and particularly we were interested in the Aguda community, which is a ethnic community in Benin, and there's some other Aguda communities elsewhere in West Africa who are the descendants of formerly enslaved persons in Brazil. Particularly, these are the descendants of people who were involved in the Malay revolt in Bahia in the 1830s. So after transatlantic slave trade ended in Brazil, starting 1850s and onwards, these folks begin coming back to Africa, and there is a critical community of them in Porto Novo, Cotonou, and other parts of southern Benin. The buildings are selected by the communities themselves. So it is not us as sort of the American side of the team to make this decisions about what is and isn't heritage. It is actually our collaborators, including the academics and the stakeholders over in Africa, who make the decisions about what we scan. We have we're actually on Saturday leaving for a third trip to Benin. And so far we have 8 different buildings scanned, including the Musée Homne, which was the 17th century palace that was the home for the Kings of Porto Novo, the Zangbeto Temple, which is an important temple voodoo community, a bunch of voodoo palaces that are being rehabilitated by a local contractor, notably the Grand Mosque that was built between 1906 and 1912 by Afro-Brazilian returners, and for a number of reasons is now at risk, and some of it is related to environmental change. These are packed earth constructions, and with climate change and infrastructure change and all sorts of other reasons, some of these buildings are actually actively falling down. For instance, the mosque lost a big chunk of the minbar, which is sort of the vaulted ceiling over their pulpit, the day before we arrived for our second trip to Benin back in June. And then we also scanned the EPA buildings, the buildings that belong to our collaborator campus as well. And as Bahare and Killion will talk about, these 3D scans are produced by a combination of a Leica surface scanner and a geospatial drone. And then they are put together into 3D models, and then georeferenced and connected to an ArcGIS hub that people can access via Story Maps interface. And we have a couple of different prototypes, including colonial architecture, the Aguda architecture, modern architecture. And what we hope to do is to document these holistically. So it's not just the buildings, but it's the neighborhoods, it's the social stories. We have interviews of community stakeholders who are parts of these communities. So the buildings aren't just things, they're not just structures, but they're part of a larger social fabric as well. And we have now some 360 virtual interviews, some of which you can access via QR code on the Instagram I shared, to go through these buildings and hear interviews from the stakeholders. We also have a couple of LiDAR-based models that were built in Sketchfab that you can go, and we have just finished, members of the team, developing the first round of a VR sim of the Zangbeto Temple. So we're looking at sort of different ways to document and share these buildings, both for public history or public cultural heritage purposes, but also the data that we're helping to collect, we hope, can be used by the communities to make the case for funding, engineering surveys, environmental surveys, and other tools that they can collect data to try to save and preserve these sites as best they can. We'll just note that we're thinking about these buildings as part of sort of an intellectual process. So to the right of the screen is the Grand Mosque of Porto Novo that I referenced, and I'll just move all of you out of the way so you can see the front of the building. So this is that beautiful mosque that is in the Aguda district in downtown Porto Novo. So finished around 1912. And then to the left of the screen, you can see the Jesus de Bom Basilica built in Goa, India in 1605. And you can see some, between the two buildings, some really similar features in terms of architects. So you can see these architectural influences traveling from culture to culture and place to place, even across several different centuries. I am now going to pass this on to Killion to talk about the scanning processes.
Thank you, Jessica. I think one of the things that I should add to the stakeholders that Jessica mentioned earlier is that we also partner with local community partners. I think that's a key element that we should add. That, you know, to Jessica's point about, you know, not us being the ones who identify buildings, but also when we are there, you know, most of the time either we are working with the local heritage office or working with building custodians. I think that's a key part.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we're planning to do this, you know, coming trip is to train some of these local partners in the technologies that we've been using. And speaking of technologies, so far we predominantly have used two kinds of technologies, which is one, LiDAR scanning technologies, and in that department we're using the tripod-mounted Leica BLK 360 scanner and the BLK drone scanner. So this way we're able to combine both the interior scanned data and overhead scanned data into one. The other thing that we've also, you know, been exploring is handheld scanning, which is you can find that on the latest iPhone or iPad capability, so that enables us to be able to scan smaller objects. But I think one of the things that we're interested in is how we can tell a much more complete story of what happens into these buildings to include artifacts. Because, for example, the voodoo temples, what happens in these voodoo ceremonies include other artifacts like masks and drums and things like that, right? So I think one of the things that we're interested in is to be able to capture those artifacts that are a key part of the activities that happen in buildings. I think we're very interested in the fact that the story of buildings is not complete until you can appreciate what happens in buildings. So that's something that in terms of the technologies we're using, we are also including those smaller objects. The other thing that I'm going to highlight with the technologies is the processing, which we have found to be the bulk. It takes the bulk of the time of processing the data once you have it scanned. And so far, we've been kind of exploring different tools, both from the bespoke softwares from Leica to Autodesk tools like Recap, which have been very good at helping us deal with the kind of large data. Can you move to the next slide?
Mm-hmm.
So in summary, I think Jessica's already mentioned these buildings that we have scanned. I won't repeat them. But one of the things that Bahare will speak about later is the geolocating this in an urban context using maps. This is really important for us because one of the things that our local partners would like to do is to be able to kind of better understand how the spread of these historic buildings are part of an urban core that they can then, you know, make sure that it's a part of future planning from a master planning standpoint of view, but also so that they can identify what is a historic district, for example, which they can lobby UNESCO for protection. So one of the kind of key things that we use in terms of technologies, ArcGIS, which my colleague Bahare is going to speak to. And these are the buildings that we have scanned so far as pilot, which are 8 buildings. And the ones on the bottom right-hand corner, which is it's a residence owned by the Patricia family, contains one of the oldest Aguda buildings in Porto Novo. And this family is actually looking to rehabilitate this building and make it a cultural center. So that's one aspect of what we're going to be doing, which is working with local partners to see if we can assist in the rehabilitation of buildings into active use. Next slide. Just a few sample images of what we get from the scans. The top right-hand corner is that's the Patricia residence that I was mentioning. It's an image that shows a combination of data from the drone scan and data from the tripod-mounted scan, which in the white lines that you can see, those are the movements of where the tripod scan is. And combined with the drone, you get a point cloud. And that point cloud, then we use it to generate 3D models that you can see at the bottom there. That's the same, it's the same project. And that way we're able to either make 3D models or make drawings, which, by the way, I think one of the key things that we find is that it's close to impossible to find original blueprints of this building. So in order to understand and have existing conditions drawing, this is the only way that we're able to get that information right now, with either scanning the way we are doing or doing it the old-fashioned way, which is handheld survey. You can see the same on the right-hand side, that the mosque, again, at the top, it's a point cloud, and it's a point cloud image that combines both the kind of overhead and tripod-mounted scanner, and that allows us to do the model that you can see at the bottom there to produce drawings and 3D CAD information. Next slide. As Jessica mentioned earlier, that we do have a Sketchfab database where these 8 buildings that we have scanned currently exist. You can find that data, and it's available for access by other researchers. This is one-to-one scale information that can be added on by others as well. And we are going to be updating this as we get funding to do more scanning and kind of high resolution of these buildings and others across the city. Last slide. So one of the things that I want to kind of highlight, and we want to kind of play this, is we have an interest in making sure that this is not just an archiving project, but also there's a way in which there is a user interface. So how can we share this information with users? And so far, we've been kind of experimenting with virtual tours that can allow high resolution 360 image tour. So the image on the bottom left-hand corner, if you scan that QR code, you can actually have a virtual tour of that mosque from inside and outside. We also animate the point cloud that we get, which is the raw data, the image on the top right-hand corner. That's an animation of the point cloud essays. And we also began to build VR experiences for these information, so that there's an opportunity for users to actually have an access of this information as tours and also as stories. One of the things that we have on this tour at the bottom left-hand corner is recordings, and also in some other situations, videos that we're able to embed into these conversations as well. Yeah, we had videos embedded in here. That's one of the slides that was eaten by our tech issues there. So yeah, I think so far these are the different ways in which we have used technology to gather the information, and use technology to process that information into CAD and usable information. At the same time, explore ways in which users can actually access it and interact with the information. And I'll pass this to my colleague Bahare, who will speak a little bit more on the ArcGIS, which is a really integral part of how we want to geolocate the information, so that it provides added layers that others can add on as well into the future.
Thank you, Killion. Jessica, wouldn't you mind to go to next slide, please?
Yeah.
Thank
Hang
you.
on.
Sure.
There we go.
Thank you. So as my coworker mentioned, we have used the GIS technology, mainly Esri ArcGIS technology, and there were multiple different apps and programs involved in this data collection, and also bringing all this in a form of a hub together. So we use Survey 123, which is very intuitive app that you can create to collect information. Once you have that app and then the survey sets, when you are traveling, you can start collecting information and data. And once you are collecting the information and data, they are going to be shown in a live view on a map. On a base map. We used a dashboard, which gives you the possibility of bringing layers of data together and being able to interact on a new level with the data sets that you have on a map, seeing like the images available for the area, or like any other type of information, the age that the building has been built, the characterization, and everything, and also being able to click on hyperlinks that they are available, going to virtual tours or others. We use the story maps for the part that we put the a storytelling part together, and eventually we use the ArcGIS Hub, which is a website creator of the Esri product, to put all these layers and information from all over the process and project together. We also, next slide, please. Thank you. One of the things that we have done in addition to using iPads to collect data was going to the library of EPA and then finding their books and the maps that they have out there, and then bringing those maps in a form of an image and then turning that image to an actual layers on a map to make it available for our partner in Africa to have access, a digital access to the map layer, not only from a book which is sitting in a library. We also worked on enhancing the base map that is available over there. On the right side, you can see the way that the Google map will shows the building, which you cannot really zoom in, and that's the resolution. So we also, as a part of this project, received some enhanced Airbus imageries to use them to have a better view of our of the area. Next slide, please. Here I have a video of urban landscape, which Jessica, if you don't mind clicking on the recorded video link, it will let you to open it. And then it is a 1 minute and 41 second. If you don't mind, just play it.
Okay.
This dashboard provides an immersive experience for understanding Porto Novo landscape. On the left side, we have an About section which shows you how to navigate the dashboard. On top, we have several selectors to help you explore different aspects of the city. On the right side, top, we have the base map selector and the legend. One of the selectors is urban block layer. Porto Novo is divided into different types of heritage district, which you can filter to Afro-Brazilian block, which represent the architectural influence of Afro-Brazilian settlers and how they shaped certain neighborhoods. Colonial block, which you see the colonial architecture that emerged during the European rule. Old Town urban block, which reflects the oldest part of the city, rich in cultural heritage. We have the landmark selector, which contains key landmarks such as the schools, religious areas, and museums. They are all symbolized accordingly. These two layers has been created via the paper maps we brought back from Benin with GIS co-op, digitized and georeferenced. We also have the layers of surveyed buildings that our team has studied in Porto Novo. By selecting a building, you can get more detailed information through the pop-ups on the map. Yeah, so as you have seen, you can just go start really on top, looking at the city, and then go to detail and then see each building that we surveyed with all the information that we added to the link. I think with that, I am at the end of my part of presentation. If you go next, please. Yes, and I will pass to Patricia.
You're muted, Patricia.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for letting me know. I didn't realize that the iPad would unmute automatically without my actually physically doing it. But I'll go ahead and wrap things up by discussing our next steps. So first, I would like to briefly discuss the theoretical conceptual framework for the interventions that underlie our project. So these provide important context for the planned expansions of our work. So our work foregrounds public memory, particularly its intersection with history, identity, power, and agency. We view these intersections as inherent in the preservation of African heritages. So we see our project as decolonial in its scope and its aims. This is not so strictly in the Fanonian sense of African peoples working to recover traumatic colonial histories, though our project does include that as an underlying set of discourses. Rather, our work is informed by the need for people of African descent to contest the enduring perception of a lack of historicity. And when I say historicity, what I refer to is the perception that people in Africa, and to some degree, those who are considered to be members of the African diaspora, have no real history, at least not a history in the sense of an affirmative set of narratives that provide the basis for identity and a sense of collective consciousness. So this is part of the legacies of colonialism. We see the recovery of heritage sites as a contestation of these perceptions. We thus see heritage as a mode, and heritage preservation as a mode of resistance to dominant perceptions. So with this in mind, we are planning similar projects in Cameroon, Togo, and Cote d'Ivoire. And unlike Ghana, Senegal, and to a lesser degree, Mozambique, there are in a few other countries, but mostly Senegal and Ghana. These countries, Cameroon and Togo and Cote d'Ivoire, are not necessarily seen as important symbolic sites, nor are they seen as diasporic home places. So we are working not in a sense to situate them that way, but rather in a sense to see them as important sites for history within Africa, and to bring in tourists both within and outside of Africa, and the tourist infrastructure and economic benefits that heritage tourism tends to bring in. So we are looking to assist in heritage preservation efforts in those countries, and possibly countries beyond those. And we're actually in the process of working to secure funding in order to engage in those projects. So with that said, I'll go ahead and end there.
Right. So one of the things that Patricia is gesturing at too, and Killion has talked about, is that we are doing, in addition to the buildings, we're collecting social stories from community members. That have included people like the King of Porto Novo. Bahare and I had an audience with him in June. The Director of Cultural Heritage for Porto Novo, the Imam who oversees the mosque. And these stories, which were recorded in French, are part of what has made its way into the narrative, the tours, the virtual tours that Killion and I both represented. You were able to click and hear some of their stories about the building, sort of adding the stories and significance from their perspective. We had also done with 360 film interviews with a family of drum makers the last time we were there, and then got a story, both them demonstrating how the djembe and other drums are made, as well as getting demonstrations on playing and all of that. So the idea is to be very interactive. And one of the things that the current VR sim, the one we have of Zangbeto that our colleague Mark led, includes the opportunity not just to walk into the Zangbeto Temple, but you can actually pick up and handle a sim of the drum and one of the masks, with the idea that eventually there are going to be some haptics programmed into the sim, and that we'll be able to extend to other different VRs. And then, as gestured, we're also looking at historic preservation, which included collecting of environmental data to help with the reconstruction, if so desired, of these buildings. So this is an example. Our colleague, Dr. Ogu, over at EPA, has access via Bluetooth through his phone of environmental data, particularly humidity and temperature data on some of these buildings from sensors. They're from Hobo Company data loggers that we installed the last time we were there. And we also did some scans of some of the buildings, the conditions of the walls. We took some ambient and other data as well, so environmental studies are increasingly going to be part of this process. So these are sort of the outputs. The archive that we have it's an artificial archive. It's based on Amazon Web Services with a couple of scalable buckets, so we can send these files, which you can imagine are massive, up to a shared bucket, whether it is our colleagues in Africa that do the scanning or us, to a shared place. And they have a CloudFront security layer on top of it. And one of our colleagues that is the programmer for data services created a code to auto-generate unique URLs that are tied to different CloudPoint data assets. So there's some data sovereignty for the African partners, and they can decide what gets pushed through the public and what sort of stays behind as sort of their own private data for cultural heritage and preservation purposes, but that they maybe don't want to share more publicly. As well as things like functional blueprints extracted from the scanning, mapping content, as well as data to otherwise advance reparative work as our colleagues in Africa and their stakeholders so decide needs to be done. And this is just the hub, the project Instagram, which I sent through the chat, but we also have a hub that you can explore as well, that Bahare's portion of the presentation highlighted. So I think now we can stop sharing and take questions.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for sharing that rich research. And I thought that the slides were fantastic, even with the tech issues. The images were brilliant. So I'm going to take, if that's okay, the chairing privilege of asking the first question, if that's okay. The first one, I think it would be for all of you, which is how long, I suppose, from start to finish does it take to create the 3D imaging and the blueprints for one of these buildings? And linked to that, I suppose, what kind of timescales have you been working to, and how does that interact with the kind of pressures like pressures from climate change that you spoke to, and how will that, I suppose, how will that look when you're looking at expanding this project?
Maybe I'll start generally, and then for the modeling questions, I'm going to hand off to Killion because he has led that particular initiative. So this started in part with a $50,000 grant from Northeastern, as well as some other funding. I think the origins are some field work that Killion did during his graduate work in Togo, the sort of concept and some of his initial conversations began with 2022. The grant came about in 2023. Our first trip over there was December of 2023, so just about a year ago. We had a second trip in June of this past year, and Killion and I are going again on Saturday for a week. So this is about a year that we have produced what we have so far, and that's just been primarily focused in Porto Novo, although we're going to spend some more time in Ouida and Cotonou this time. Killion, do you want to address the modeling question?
Yes, thank you, Jessica. I think on the specifics of, say you have a building scan, I think it depends mainly on the size of the building. Like for example, the mosque, which has multiple rooms. So, you would have to go from each room to scan that room and then fly the drone. But all in all, the mosque, which was the biggest of the building that we had to scan, that probably takes about 3 to 4 hours maximum, I would say, to scan and complete in doing it slowly, considering other factors that have to deal with, which is the drone not connecting to GPS and things like that. What takes longer is the processing. So that is what we found, that once you've got the point cloud, which is it's really raw data, registering it, and registering means like all the kind of scans, connecting them together to create one scan. And then from that scan, using software to generate CADs from it. Unfortunately, we still yet don't have a flawless system of auto-generating models from point clouds. You still have to kind of either draw it using standard architectural software, or auto create surfaces which you can't do models for. So that's what take longer. So a typical, the mosque, for example, that would take, I would say, probably about 3 weeks, 3 weeks minimum to really clean up and get all the information to a point where you have a 3D model, right? And then after that, it depends on what you want out of the model, whether you want to create VR or you want to create 2D drawings, which is elevations planned and stuff, right? So you have the model, but then you can decide what you want to do with it. And that usually, once you have the model, it's easier to generate other information. The other interesting question also regarding the environment. So right now, the Porto Novo is built next to a lagoon. And that lagoon, the water levels are slowly rising. And a lot of the buildings that are within the kind of water table level of the lagoon are greatly affected, both the CMU buildings, like concrete block buildings, and stabilized earth blocks. Stabilized earth blocks, which is what most of the buildings we are scanning are made of, they're the worst affected, because obviously you can imagine they were not built with waterproofing, right? Because this is a new phenomenon, which is the high levels of groundwater. So they are really under threat. One of the buildings across the Patricia residence that we scanned is completely gone. Like the walls just caved and they could not repair structurally. So there is an urgent need for especially the stabilized earth blocks that are within the area of the water table of the lagoon, to have some strategies for mitigating strategy for structural stability. So that's the bit that we really have not even begun to get into. I think Jessica was mentioning some earlier information we're beginning to gather regarding, what is the level of humidity of these walls, what is the change in, heat and temperature inside and outside. So the next level of this, which we're looking for funding, is really to also enable that study, including, I think, and I'll shut up after this, including the Patterson residents, which we're going to be working with them towards rehabilitation. What are the mitigating design strategies that one can do to a building like that is threatened by high water levels? How do you deal with materials? How do you deal with the water itself? So that could be a lesson for other building owners that have the same challenges within the area. Yeah. So I hope I answered your question, but generally I think that's what it would take to process the information. But the environmental question is it's almost like an existential threat for a lot of destabilized buildings that are within that area.
I'll add to that. So there are problems like, for instance, the mosque. There are issues with invasive fauna. There are some trees that have grown up into the walls of this mosque and have become load bearing. So that's going to be an entire architectural and engineering question, not just to sort of see what's going on, but is it possible to save those without causing more damage? In terms of the Patterson residence, one of the things that we saw when we were there last time and interviewing Mr. Patterson, it's this beautiful early 19th or 20th century home or late 18th, 19th century, multi-generation. It's owned by a gentleman who is descendant of two very powerful Beninois Dahomey clans, the Medeiros and the de Sousa families, for those of you who are familiar with the history of that part of the world. But in addition to the environmental factors, it's on what is now a fairly busy Porto Novo street, and the vibrations from modern vehicle traffic are starting to cause cracks or encourage cracking in the walls, from trucks or lorries, from motorcycles, which are the primary mode of transportation. And when you get a critical mass of those, you get the noise vibrations too.
Thank you. Yeah, that was exactly kind of what my question was alluding to, I suppose, which is how you both track and have an idea of what is there and what's going on, but also the sense of urgency that's needed to potentially, preserve these buildings if that is what is desired. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, please do put them in the chat. James, I think you have a question, don't you?
Yeah, thank you so much all for a really lovely presentation. It's really lovely work. I guess one of my questions is around sort of what's emerging from this in terms of sort of historical knowledge. I wondered if you could share some examples with us of the sorts of things you're starting to know about these buildings' histories, I guess, that you didn't before that process of capture began. And I guess I'm asking here sort of a question around the theme of, what the archiving process produces rather than just what the archiving process archives, if that makes sense. So it's sort of, what are you starting to know? I mean, I'm not asking, what are you publishing right now and stuff. What are you starting to know about these buildings from doing this work?
Well, I think one thing we're knowing, and this is mostly the interviewing process, is that, the archives are more than just papers. Like many of us as historians are trained to think about paper archives. But in a lot of ways, this is a colleague, Hillary Green, who does 19th century Black history, thinks about like front porch archives, meaning the oral histories, the community stories, as a big piece of that archive. They're the ones that can talk about the memory of these buildings. They're the ones that can talk about the policy stuff that is maybe less visible to outsiders. One of the things that we learned when we were asking about the mosque, and specifically the challenges of figuring out what to do with it, is that because historic preservation is really sort of local phenomenon, as it is in a lot of places, right? They didn't have the legal infrastructure to protect that mosque. It was the modern buildings and new constructions, which will sound familiar to a lot of places, that are getting privileged over trying to save these buildings of the past. It's also being able to go and observe them. Like the mosque is not currently safe for occupancy. It has a custodian that will let people in to look at it. But if you walk around that mosque, even though it's not actively a house of worship right now, you see community members gathered around, sitting on its steps, sharing stories, sharing meals. We saw this young boy, I think was maybe about 8 years old, who was using it as a place to brace his family's livestock, to wash them, and then moving from one side to the other as he cleaned them and moving on. And he also, I think, got annoyed that the adults weren't paying enough attention to him and scared one of his cows into our drone landing site while we were trying to scan, because kids are kids, right? No matter what. But, seeing these as sort of artifacts, living, breathing artifacts, in addition to buildings, you don't get that just by studying remotely. You have to get in and see it.
Yeah, and I would add to that another one of the things that we're discovering or kind of expanding the knowledge on, particularly academic knowledge, but also knowledge outside of academia, are the important role of communicative technologies in preserving history and heritage, particularly those that are precarious in terms of the ability to outlast the various forces that could be involved in kind of making heritage go away. So media have always been very heavily implicated in the preservation of history and the production of memory. So, you know, the more traditional technologies like photography, television, film, which with the exception of photography to some degree, are more top-down technologies that are helpful in preserving particular historical narratives. We see ours as in the work that we're doing, particularly in training folks, as a little bit more of a bottom-up mode, a kind of a democratization of the means of historical production. So we also see that as one of the contributions that our project makes to historical knowledge.
Can I just follow up on that? Is that all right, Alice? Because I had a related kind of set of thoughts that I wanted to ask you about anyway, but what Patricia said kind of made me think about it, how it works, which is that I guess I'm curious about how that bottom up, the kind of oral histories, the social participation, how that feeds into sort of formal types of knowledge production, which we of course don't have to embrace. We can also resist. So the kind of the cataloging, the kind of documentary practices, and how those kind of counter discourses feed into those spaces. You said, for example, the partners own the stuff. Do they also own how the meaning is made around the stuff? And I'm just curious about how, you know, you're obviously creating a lot of metadata that's kind of formal structured metadata that comes out of systems, but I'm also curious about that kind of descriptive practices and how they are embedded into the kind of the meaning making.
Well, I would say they definitely own the meaning making, and you know, this is an ongoing conversation, so things around the metadata may change. And certainly we kind of see ourselves as their sort of tech support, but the idea is that they're going to be in the driver's seat. So we kind of help get things started. They tell us what they want preserved, they tell us what they want shared. But ultimately the goal is that, you know, the tech they're going to be in their hands and they're going to be doing the primary drivers, although we'll wind up helping them with probably continuing to help to process this data. You know, one of the things we too have now with the hub is that it's in English, and we're going to have to work on finding money to get a French version of that built, because of course English is not one of the primary languages in Benin, even though a lot of the Beninois do speak English. But you know, where the languages there's not just French, but there's Fon, there's you know, the indigenous, the local languages, Portuguese, because it is such a socioethnically diverse area, right? And it's going to have to be them that makes these decisions, not us. It's not our place.
Yeah, and if I can just add one big anecdote as well, that you know, where I come from in Africa, which is south in Botswana, you know, the museum, the Ministry of Tourism, where the museum probably would be, typically are the ones that are tasked with protecting heritage. And usually what happens is that the folks who are, you know, very educated, work at the museum, end up being the experts at this subject, end up being the ones that curate, tell the stories, and usually the building custodians and the community are, you know, they're at arm's length in this process. And I've always been critical of that process, because I think, you know, heritage and the value of heritage in us needs to be a little bit more inclusive, just beyond the folks that are, you know, at the museum organizations tasked with. I think what we find in Benin is that although they have a little bit less resources in that department, there is a willingness to actually expand the stakeholders. And that means that our partners with the EPA school, which is the heritage school, talking to the imams, all of this is not frowned upon, which I think is great. And in the ideal world, I think this idea of curating the stories and the narratives, if there are ways in which, again, for me, leverage technology to expand that conversation so that heritage making, if there's such a thing, it's not just design, it's not just, assigned to a few who are in the bureaucracy of governance, right? But it could also be within building custodians and community members who live in those neighborhoods, who ultimately identify with those assets. So I think for me that is something that as we go, we're going to be kind of trying to find a framework that can really anchor that. And I think all the countries we mentioned earlier about expanding to, we don't see ourselves going to any of these without local partners. I think of the primary approach of growth is we have local partners first who want and see this as a value, and then we build the network from that. So this bottom up is really based off of that idea that if I was to go to Botswana, for example, the first thing I'll do is resist what I know is there, which is, first you'll have to go to the Ministry of something, and then they'll just work with you and nobody else, right? So that's the first thing that I will resist, because the bottom up, really, we want to kind of expand the network to include other custodians of these assets.
And I will say too that it's sort of a lot of community engagement and trust building too, because of course there have been a lot of very badly behaved Westerners, not just in history and museum studies, but other fields in health sciences, environmental studies, and all that. One of the things we had hoped to do on the last trip is to be able to scan some masks that are in a private collection in Porto Novo, and we originally thought we were going to be able to do that, but our contact backed off. He was freaked out, probably because people have done him dirty, to be blunt. So we wound up not being able to scan those masks. So sort of being aware of this sort of who's in the driver's seat, but also sort of being aware of these are decades, if not a century plus, of poorly behaved Westerners and institutions and, Eurocentric organizations that have done a lot of harm. You just have to really, watch our positionality a lot.
Yeah, we certainly see that as part of the colonial legacies that folks, local residents are having to navigate in trying to preserve their history. And of course, we're implicated in that as well as people who are coming in and trying to assist in these efforts. So we all have to, negotiate these enduring legacies of colonialism and the kind of emotions and rational thoughts as well that these legacies tend to engender on both sides.
And being aware that even if we weren't the direct people involved, we're affiliated with the people who've done harm, and we're the visual and immediately available representatives of people who've done harm. And sometimes you just have to recognize that people need to be mad at you because there's decades of really, really a lot of anger and hurt, and you represent that hurt even if it's not you personally. So you don't take it personally, but you recognize that this is going to be part of the deal, is that you have to that you're probably going to be confronted by some angry, mistrustful people because of so much misbehavior.
Yeah.
And Killion used the word frameworks, and implicated came up, and and I think one of the tricks with some of this work, I guess, do it well, is to not just say, well, the old experts who tended to do things like in the ministry, for example, Killion, we displace those and get different people to tell stories. It's also ensuring you don't end up replicating the same frameworks that come out of that. I mean, you're making me think of Anna Rostola's work and things like duress, and the idea that many structures of meaning making, for example, have long legacies, which end up with the systems we now rely on to create, say, metadata structures. And even those things, just replacing one set of voices speaking into those with another set of voices speaking into those, doesn't necessarily do the kind of work that needs to be done. Sometimes the frameworks themselves need troubling and revising, and yeah.
Right. I mean, this came up with the discussion of the Benin bronzes, of course. Broadly construed is that there were these activists that were pushing back against the theft and pushing for reparation and restoration, and people dismissed them and ignored them until a couple of folks that were affiliated with Oxbridge institutions started to make a fuss, and then they wind up getting credit, despite the fact that there are others folks that had been doing this work that got ignored or dismissed, and it became another discussion about systems, right?
Sorry, Alice, I hijacked a chunk of that.
Not at all. I have another question, if that's okay, and it's about the GIS mapping. I really enjoyed the video tutorial of that, and I was just wondering, I suppose speaking to the idea about the democratization of research, because I think you said that the audience would be other researchers, and so I was wondering who has access to the map with the different layers, and also who's able to add to the map with the different layers, and perhaps any other layers that you're considering.
Absolutely. So practically through the hub, one of the results of using the ArcGIS hub is giving access to our partner to not only be able to look over the dashboard and everything, because if you open the link to the hub right now, the link that Killion put in the chat, you will see that you will have access to all the dashboard, all the information and all. But who can download it? It is at the moment, it is our partner that they can go online. They can, we will provide them. We actually already provide access code for them, so they can go online and start downloading the information and data through the hub. Because one of the reasons is practically empowering them, being able to run through the work. And in this new trip that Killion and Jessica are going, we are going to send recorded tutorial for the EPA students to be able to learn how to create survey 1 to 3, how to be able to collect information data, and how to add it to the maps. So one of the parts that coming in, it is educating the students of EPA to be able to contribute more and create the maps and the surveys. If you would like to add anything, Killion, but I think I covered it, but that's how it worked so far. Okay.
That's great, thank you.
Okay.
Does anyone have any final questions before we wrap up?
I do have one.
Go on.
This is the bit of the seminar where I get sentimental and remember our late departed colleague, Richard de Swart, who would often ask the question which you kind of to some extent dealt with, Patricia, which is like, what's next? And I kind of have a variant of that question, because you told us a bit about what's next, and you told us a bit about the fact that and Jessica told us about the fact that there's a trip planned very, very soon. I guess my variant then is like, what do we need to look out for with this project over the next few months? What are you really excited that you can't tell us about something that you haven't sort of revealed yet, but sort of like what do we need to look out for the next few months? What you're working on?
Killion, as the lead, do you want to jump on that?
Wow. So we have our fingers crossed for getting a couple of grants that we have in, which are going to enable us to do the launch of the citywide scan in Porto Novo. I think that to us is, because so far we've been piloting. We're really excited to kind of expand this and make our dashboard and our archives, and also professionally launch them. The thing that I, as an architect, I'm super excited about, again, as I mentioned, the partisan residence is one of those that is going to bridge between collecting data, working with the municipal government, the building custodian, the other local stakeholders, including architects and others, to create a cultural center that is going to celebrate the legacy of the Aguda. I think for me that, you know, I as an architect, I don't think I'll sleep well if all I can do is just archive. I'd like to be able to kind of move from archive to actually, making one of these buildings comes back to life and learn about the things we talked about. How do we deal with issues of flooding, materials, and things like that? So that project is going to be, proceeding regardless of funding. That project is going to proceed in the design phase anyway, because we'll need funding to make it happen. So those are the kind of short-term things. I think the long-term things that we really hope to do is regionally, as Jessica mentioned at the beginning. This inspiration of this project started in Togo, and it was looking at kind of vernacular Takienta mud towers, which are really cool African typology type of building. So it's something that going into the future, I think I would like to be able to also get into that kind of rural documentation of architecture that is not just urban, but architecture that is made out of necessity of farming, necessity of, dwelling in a specific environment, like that produces different types of buildings. So I think that documentation of those heritage buildings across that, those countries we mentioned, which is Cameroon, Togo, and the third one.
Côte d'Ivoire.
Yeah, Côte d'Ivoire. Sorry, Côte d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast. That excites me from a long-term standpoint. So yeah, I think those are short-term and kind of long-term things that we are working towards.
Yeah, it's going to involve both working on funding, and we have hit send on probably half a dozen at least grants at this point in collaboration with EPA. But it's also, since it's a large and very scalable project, we probably wind up looking for partners elsewhere that can help with going after grants to help to expand the work.
Fantastic. Thank you. Fingers crossed for your grants after them they come in. Right, so I think we're at time now. So I just want to say another huge thank you for our speakers today. Such rich research and fantastic discussion. We will be uploading this recording to YouTube so that it is shareable and searchable. And in the meantime, I'd like to invite you all to our next seminar, which is our postgraduate panel on Tuesday, the 14th of January. But yes, thank you all so much. Thank you to our speakers, and have a fantastic evening/morning, depending where you are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.